to thank you very much for that kind reminder that I can't hold that job. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Dr. Denevers and the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism for the invitation to be here today as one of the David Everett post-conflict reconstruction speakers, which is very unique, even have a speaker series like that. Having seen the list of the prior speakers, I only hope I can live up to that great tradition and your expectations. But speaking of tradition, I think it is a special honor to be speaking here today, since it is almost 92 years to the date that George Holmes Maxwell founded the Maxwell School, with its unique objective of, quote unquote, teaching practitioners those principles, facts, and elements which make up our rights and duties and values as U.S. citizens, unquote. And also, apropos of the season, and I don't mean jack-o'-lanterns and Halloween and a normal orange around this city, it is especially important to talk about some of the lessons we can and must learn from Afghanistan, which is America's longest war. And apropos of last night's debate, we could also call it America's longest forgotten war. I didn't hear any discussion of Afghanistan. Did you? And this isn't unusual. I think somebody actually commented that in the last 2 presidential cycles, a total of about 10 to 12 words were mentioned on Afghanistan. But we will spend more than that today about Afghanistan. But before I do, let me pause here and ask, since this is a center of higher learning, an existential question. An existential question that audiences such as yourselves have asked of speakers such as me for centuries. And that is, who are you, and why should I be listening to you? Especially since I probably, meaning you, probably spent time watching the debate last night and not doing your homework, or time over at Fagan's because it was flip night. So why am I here and why should you be here? My mission as the CIGAR, that little tobacco-related organization, which has nothing to do with tobacco, and that is the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, is twofold. One, to identify and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse in Afghanistan reconstruction effort. And the second, to provide recommendations to allow us to better respond to future contingencies, the ones you may find yourselves working on a decade or 2 from now. Now, you may wonder, why did Congress create this strange organization called CIGAR? Just to focus on reconstruction in Afghanistan, of all places. Now, to understand that, you need to understand the sheer scale of the effort on reconstruction in Afghanistan. To date, the United States taxpayer has spent nearly $115 billion, that's billion with a B, on the Afghanistan reconstruction effort. More than on any other reconstruction effort in any other country in the history of our republic. And more on the entire Marshall Plan to reconstruct Europe after World War II, adjusted for inflation. Now, Congress, in its infinite wisdom, did not have faith that the agencies involved in reconstruction were going to be able to oversee that expenditure. Nor did they have faith that the normal oversight function of inspectors general at AID, USAID, DOD, and state could live up to the task. Ergo, my office, CIGAR, was created in 2008. Now, you may not be familiar, I'm assuming most of you are not familiar with inspectors general in general or special inspectors general specifically. There are 75 of us, although there are only 2 special inspector generals. One for SIGTARP, which has to do with reconstruction efforts, and myself. What makes CIGAR unique among all of them is, first of all, we are not housed in any particular federal agency like all the rest of the IGs, special and otherwise. Our job is to have jurisdiction over just Afghanistan and just Reconstruction, but every dollar spent in Afghanistan on Reconstruction by whichever agency spends it. So whether it's salaries for the Afghan Army and police, paid for by the Department of Defense, hospitals and schools, paid for by USAID, drug eradication and law enforcement, paid for by the State Department and the Justice Department, or USDA funding to set up a soybean market, which unfortunately failed to the tune of $30 million in Afghanistan, that's our job to oversee. Given the scale of the investment, it is a daunting enterprise, and time is of the essence. SIGAR is a temporary agency. Yes, there are temporary agencies in Washington, D.C., not like the old T-testing board that survived for 200 years. We do go out of existence when the amount of authorized, appropriated, and not yet spent funds fall below $250 million. Unfortunately, there is $10 billion in the pipeline of authorized, appropriated, and not yet spent funds. But regardless, we know the American people are tired of this war in Afghanistan. So I demand that my roughly 200 employees must move fast, work hard, and maintain what I call a fit bead, fire in the belly. And we're not simply bean counters sitting behind desks in D.C. We have now approximately 35 people forward deployed in Kabul and are constantly rotating headquarters staff, auditors and investigators and inspectors through there every year. Now, things to remember is we have the largest oversight presence for the U.S. government in Afghanistan. More than the FBI, I think they only have about 5 people. More than GAO, they have 0. More than the other IGs combined. And that's good. Afghanistan's our middle name, and so is Reconstruction. So we should be there. Given that security is so bad that you have to take a helicopter for the 3-kilometer trek from the airport in downtown Kabul to the embassy in downtown Kabul, it is a tough environment, and I'm grateful to my staff for taking up this important work. Their sacrifices have resulted in some impressive results. We have issued nearly 250 audits, inspections, alert letters, and other products that have included nearly 700 recommendations to a multitude of agencies, and over 85% of which I can say have been adopted. In addition, our investigations unit, because we have full law enforcement authority, and gun-toting law enforcement agents, have conducted several hundred investigations resulting in over 100 arrests, 125 indictments, 100 convictions or guilty pleas, and nearly 100 sentences. Our little agency has to date identified nearly $2 billion in savings, including $950 million in civil fines and penalties. Now, while I personally feel all of this is impressive, given our small size and our annual budget of only $50 million approximately per year, we at SIGAR hope to make a longer-term impact beyond the indictments, audits, and inspections. As I said earlier, history has a funny way of repeating itself. More to the point, basically after every international intervention the United States has been engaged in, starting with World War II, we've heard promises from politicians that we won't do nation building ever again. Yet over 9,000 U.S. troops sit in Afghanistan, and 1,000 more have returned to Iraq. So if we're going to keep doing this, which I am afraid we will, shouldn't we find a way to do it better? Which leads us to SIGAR's Lessons Learned program. I'll admit this part of our mission wasn't at the forefront of my mind when I was called by the White House 4.5 years ago to take the job as SIGAR. But in meetings with generals and ambassadors and others, I constantly heard the refrain that we must learn from these 15 years of United States has spent in Afghanistan. In particular, General John Allen, the former commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who served 2 stints in Afghanistan as our ambassador, said it was pivotal that SIGAR undertake this work because we are the sole federal agency in the entire federal government with cross-agency jurisdiction. We are the sole agency that can look at the whole of government approach to Reconstruction. And for those of you who study Reconstruction, that is the format we will use in the future. Not only whole of government here, but whole of government agencies with international organizations, and we have jurisdiction to look at our relationship with the international community. These gentlemen and others told me that too often lesson-learned efforts, if they're undertaken at all, are stovepiped. They look at one agency because they are authored by a single agency. And frankly, the Defense Department is the only one who does them with any regularity. USAID did an evaluation of all its work in Afghanistan up to the Soviet invasion. It was written in the early 1980s. It was a massive tome and well written and identified many problems that we find today with USAID programs in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, we could only find one copy of it, and it was located in a library in Kabul, and we could find no one in USAID or our embassy who had ever heard of it or read it. That's the question between lessons observed, lessons learned, and lessons actually applied. So SIGAR has set up a lessons learned program, and we are currently undertaking a half dozen separate reports with more to come on everything from U.S. counter-narcotics, strategy in Afghanistan, to the interagency policy process. But the first one out of the gate, which was released just last month, appropriately, and this is it, it's online, although we have some hard copies in the back, focused on anti-corruption efforts in Afghanistan. The report, called Corruption and Conflict, Lessons from the U.S. Experience in Afghanistan, is also available on our website, www.sigar.mil. And yes, contrary to popular belief, there are places more corrupt than Albany, in my old stomping grounds of Cleveland and Youngstown, Ohio. And in particular, Afghanistan is one of them. Prior to the release of our report, the significance of corruption and its impact on Reconstruction efforts was best summed up by a report commissioned by now Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Joe Dunford, back when he was the commanding general in Afghanistan. That report stated, quote, "The corruption directly threatens the viability and legitimacy of the Afghan state, alienates key elements of the population, discredits the government and security forces, undermines international support, subverts state functions and rule of law, robs the state of revenue, and creates barriers to economic growth." In other words, it's a problem. SIGAR's recently released Lessons Learned report, nearly 2 years in the making, interviewed dozens of officials from all the relevant agencies, including state, DOD, aid, treasury, justice, all the other government agencies, as well as the Afghan government and the European comrades, and reviewed thousands of documents. Remember, whole of government approach. Many of these documents were open sources, and some were not available to the public. In short, our research found, similarly, what the Dunford report found when looking at DOD. It found that anti-corruption efforts were often the ugly stepchild of the Reconstruction effort, that the international Reconstruction efforts actually made corruption worse. Other policy and political objectives were given a higher priority, and even when anti-corruption efforts were prioritized, they met a wall of resistance from the Afghan government. But as our report noted, rather than being subordinate to or mutually exclusive from security or Reconstruction goals, anti-corruption efforts are a fundamental piece of creating lasting security, political stability, and a strong and sustainable Afghan economy. All things, you'll note, that Afghanistan currently lacks. The United States and our coalition partners obviously did not enter Afghanistan with the goal of making corruption worse. And certainly, corruption existed in Afghanistan years before we arrived in 2001. But early on, in an effort to maintain a light footprint in Afghanistan, the U.S. decided to partner with abusive and corrupt warlords in order to run al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of the country. These individuals were then in a position to demand positions in the newly formed Afghan government, which enabled them to access the streams of cash pouring into a virtually non-existent economy, with a complete lack of judicial and legal structures to prevent abuse. Combined with limited U.S. oversight of funds and our government's perverse incentive structure, which rewards U.S. government officials with pushing money out the door without ever holding any accountable for how well that money is spent, U.S. and coalition taxpayer dollars were sloshing around the Afghan economy like a bathtub running over. Eventually, 8 years into the reconstruction effort, U.S. officials became increasingly concerned that corruption was fueling the insurgency by financing insurgent groups and stoking popular grievances. U.S. agencies, notably Treasury, the Justice Department, and others, set up and supported several U.S. and Afghan organizations to tackle the problem. However, by then, the U.S. efforts in Afghanistan were so deeply entrenched that there were two major obstacles to the success of these anti-corruption efforts. First, U.S. efforts were increasingly reliant on the cooperation of the Afghan government to achieve certain security goals and were hesitant to rock the boat. And second, even when they mustered the fortitude to rock the boat, the Afghans knew they had us over the barrel. For example, an aide to then-President Karzai named Mohammad Zia Salehi was thought to have contributed to the laundering of nearly $3 billion out of the country. The U.S. mentored Major Crimes Task Force, it was an Afghan task force, used wiretaps to collect enough evidence, and working with Afghan law enforcement, played the tapes to a senior aide to Karzai who authorized Salehi's arrest. In July 2010, the task force arrested Salehi. Within hours, President Karzai ordered his release, and charges were ultimately dropped. The task force never again felt it could successfully prosecute cases in Afghanistan. President Karzai was also disinterested in pursuing any of the officials responsible for the Ponzi scheme, otherwise called the Kabul Bank, that led to nearly $1 billion in assets disappearing from Afghanistan. Now that's equivalent to $1 trillion here in the United States. The reluctance was not limited to Afghan officials. Ahmed Wali Karzai, the president's brother, who basically ran Kandahar province, was widely assumed to be involved in the opium trade, which helped fund the insurgency. Yet coalition commanders operating in Kandahar would consistently state that they needed Karzai's assistance to know what was going on in Kandahar and to protect their forces. And we have to admit, and we do say so in the report, that the situation in Kandahar deteriorated after Karzai was assassinated in 2011. So we are realistic and not suggesting these are easy choices between corruption and counterterrorism. But essentially, when coalition lives are at stake, it's extremely difficult. But it is a challenge that we have to approach and actually make a cost-benefit analysis when we go make our bed with such people as Wali Karzai. None of our work, including this report, which actually tells the history of Afghanistan from the corruption angle. It's an interesting report. I advise all of you to read it. But nothing in that report is meant as a negative critique even, or a criticism of the many brave and honest men and women who have served and continue to serve in Afghanistan. Nor is our report meant to imply that all Afghans are corrupt, nor impugn the thousands of Afghans who on a daily basis fight corruption, many times to their personal detriment. Rather, this report is an account of the U.S. experience addressing corruption in Afghanistan, and hopefully will lead to new thinking and new efforts before we encounter a similar situation in the future. Now let me briefly discuss the lessons our report identified. First, anti-corruption efforts must be a top priority so that corruption does not sabotage the overall objectives of a reconstruction effort. As Ambassador Crocker told my staff, quote, "The corruption lens has got to be in place at the outset, and even before the outset, in the formulation of reconstruction and development strategy. Because once it gets to the level he saw, it's somewhere between unbelievably hard and outright impossible to fix," unquote. Second, U.S. agencies must analyze and jointly understand how corruption works in the political economy and networks of a host country. In Afghanistan, the U.S. was too slow to understand the dangers that virtually unimpeded corruption posed because our government didn't understand how it had infiltrated virtually every corner of the Afghan society. If corruption can be analogized to the redwood tree, we need to identify all the roots and follow them wherever they may lead, whether to the government or the enemy or even to our own forces. Afghans started supporting the insurgency because they were tired of government corruption. At the same time, the insurgency was benefiting financially from all of the corruption. It was a win-win for the insurgency, and the coalition didn't realize it quickly enough. The third lesson is that the U.S. government must better assess how much foreign assistance a host country can reasonably absorb without completely distorting the economy, and improve our own ability to oversee and monitor that assistance. Imagine pouring water on a sponge. At some point, the sponge becomes full and the water spills off to the side. In terms of foreign assistance, amounts provided that are more than 15 to 45% of a country's annual GDP is generally considered counterproductive. 15 to 45%, and usually the less developed the country, the lower it is. On multiple occasions, U.S. assistance alone equaled Afghanistan's annual GDP, so more than double the high end of the recommendation, and was over the high end of 45% every year from 2004 to 2013. Combine this with poor oversight and contracting practices, this was a recipe for disaster. Fourth, the U.S., when possible, should limit alliances with malign power brokers. In other words, the bad guys, the mafias. As I noted earlier, decisions about who to deal with in a war zone can be complicated, particularly in places where blood is on virtually everybody's hand. That said, the least we should do is a cost-benefit analysis of whether partnering with that particular warlord or corrupt official is worth the cost of perpetuating corruption further. The mission must come first, but winning the mission requires limiting corruption. And it's so important in a place like Afghanistan, where many of the people were driven originally to the insurgency because of corruption. We come in and open the floodgates, and we lead to that continuing corruption. I think somebody yesterday asked me about why many of the surveys show that the views on corruption has actually gotten worse even as our drawdown has occurred. In part it was because everybody realized that the spigot was shutting down, so many Afghans said, you got to steal it now because it's not going to be around anymore. Fifth lesson is anti-corruption efforts must be seen as a key contributor to overall security and stability goals, and not simply a nice thing to have, unquote. We know corruption has undermined the mission in Afghanistan, so anti-corruption efforts should not be marginalized to the sidelines. Finally, none of these recommendations will bear any fruit unless there is a political will at every level of the U.S. government to treat anti-corruption as a major goal and to insist on cooperation from our partners. In Afghanistan, corruption flowed from the top down, yet the U.S. too often attempted to rely on technical approaches to fix it without having the difficult conversation necessary to force change from the top. Given the Karzai regime, perhaps such efforts may not have worked, but we should have at least tried. In addition to these key lessons, SIGAR made 11 recommendations, 3 to Congress and 8 to the executive branch. Such things as improving contractor vetting efforts and sanctioning corrupt leaders need to be on the table. And I encourage you, again, to look at the report for more details. But the single most important thing the government needs to do is prioritize anti-corruption efforts. Congress needs to insist on it and hold the executive branch accountable for it. Every agency involved in Reconstruction must think about anti-corruption in every action they take and program they fund. And the National Security Council needs to ensure it stays a major political priority. Now, as I said earlier, our goal with this report was not to criticize or condemn the dedicated Americans who have dealt a very tough hand in Afghanistan. That said, egos in Washington bruise easily. One top USAID official testified when asked by a senator about a report, said he didn't find it helpful to be reminded that there was a corruption problem in Afghanistan, unquote. I understand why people may feel frustrated that SIGAR is pointing out things that they've known about. Unfortunately, too many have refused to publicly discuss. These problems are problems a lot have known about, but no one has told the American taxpayer before we invested our money there. There are a lot of people in Washington who have their careers or who have made their careers, I should say, on many of the failed programs in Afghanistan. Whether anything, well, you've probably read some of our reports. We've spent millions of dollars buying rare white Italian goats, or building a gas station that no one needed, or building a $40 million headquarters that nobody wanted, or building a school that melted. Many people, whether they're ambassadors, generals, bureaucrats, contractors, or even congressional staff, have an invested interest in many of the programs that we are pointing out. They obviously are very defensive about what we find and publish. At best, they wish that we do our work quietly and that we keep it out of the public view. But I believe in transparency. I reject that view. I think transparency and publicity are two virtues we ignore to the peril of all of us in Washington and elsewhere. The U.S. government pours out thousands of reports a year. How many do you hear about? For nearly 25 years, I have worked in Congress looking at failed bureaucratic programs. I have been blessed, and it is a blessing, to have worked under the tutelage of some great statesmen. Senator Sam Nunn, former Senators Cohen and others, and Levin, Rudman, you name it, on both sides of the political spectrum, as well as Congressman John Dingell, who was the father of modern oversight. And I learned from all of them that if you want to change something in Washington, it needs to be under the public spotlight. In the oft-quoted statement of former Supreme Court Justice Brandeis, quote, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." For Sigar, that means that taxpayers have a right to know how their money is being spent, even if it's inconvenient or embarrassing for some bureaucrats, politicians, congressional staffers, contractors, and foreign governments. You know, to the criticism that some of our reports may be sensational, I think back to what Harry Truman said. Give him hell, Harry, remember? And they complained that he used that term even. And he said, I never said give him hell when I was talking about the opponents in the Congress. I just told the truth, and they thought it was hell. That's the way we view complaints about sensationalism. We just state the facts. The facts themselves are sensational. And I have no control over that. And I think the more we heard the facts, it would be sensational. We could maybe do something. You know, I don't know if any of you have had a family member, colleague who's had an abuse with narcotics or alcohol and have worked their way. Very difficult thing. View corruption, view incompetency, view waste, fraud, and abuse almost like having a drug problem. The first step, there may be 7 steps for alcohol and drugs, but the first step for all of that is recognizing you have a problem. If you hide the reports under classification, bogus classification, or you don't want it publicized, you're not admitting you got a problem. And that's what we face in Washington. That's what every IG faces in Washington, D.C. My office undertook the Anti-Corruption Lessons Learned report, like all of our reports, to encourage and enact improvements, to change things for the better. It was not a paper exercise. I didn't take this job to kill a bunch of trees, nor did I take this job to create headlines or fodder for late-night TV or comedy routines. Although I'll be honest with you, some of the reports we make are pretty funny. It is important to all of you who plan to be practitioners in public policy, administration, the law, journalism, or whatever, to remember the fundamental importance of transparency and publicity in any democracy, whether it's the United States or any country overseas. Jeremy Bentham said that without publicity, no good is permanent. Under the auspices of publicity, no evil can continue. This has been the bedrock of our republic. Remember, it was Thomas Jefferson who said he would rather have a free press without a government than a government without a free press. But in practical terms, why is transparency and publicity so important? I've learned from my years of studying government bureaucracies, there are a number of reasons. First of all, transparency and publicity can bring problems to the attention of senior leaders whose staff generally avoid telling them bad news. Transparency and publicity can deter government contractors from cutting corners, using substandard materials, or tolerating unsafe practices. SIGAR has referred over 750 entities for suspension and debarment, essentially recommending they be prevented from working with the government. And it's not one of those things that a contractor wants to know about or be listed for. Transparency and publicity can deter fraud. When someone considering breaking the law reads about a federal civilian military member or contractor going to jail and paying big fines, they may decide to resist the entreaties of whoever incentivizing them to look the other way. Transparency and publicity can encourage people to come forward to the IG community or other law enforcement agencies. Some of our best tips have come from senior officials, including generals and ambassadors, who approach us because they know about us and they know we do something with this from the press. We also receive calls every day from ordinary Afghans using our hotline in Afghanistan, again, because they know about us. Transparency and publicity can educate by pointing out successes and best practices, which we talk about in this Lessons Learned report, which we hope can encourage agencies to continue improving their performance. Transparency and publicity can change the way individuals work. Think of it yourself when you go on that New York thruway. When you see the cop with the radar gun, what do? You slow down. I remember having a general come over to my office from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and he said, "Sopko, I don't like you, but you're like that cop on the Jersey Turnpike. I look in the rearview mirror when I know you're doing an investigation." And it's very interesting. We had a staffer who went back to Christmas family get-together last Christmas in Minnesota. And he heard one of his uncles or whatever, who was a contractor, talking to somebody else about a contract, and he didn't want to get in trouble. And he was saying, "What's this all about?" He says, "Well, I don't want to end up like those guys in Camp Leatherneck." Well, that was the 64K building we exposed. That was the one where it was the headline in the Military Times saying, "What the hell were they thinking?" They built a 64,000 square foot building that the people who were in Camp Leatherneck, which was our military base, didn't want, and said we'll never use it, so don't build it. But we spent $36 million anyway. So when a guy who is going for a contract in Minnesota says, "I don't want to get in trouble on this contract in Afghanistan," and cites one of our reports, you know we have actually reached out and touched someone. We've reached out and touched the average contractor who says, "I don't want to end up on the front page of the New York Times or the Military Times." And most importantly, transparency and publicity gives American taxpayers, I think now more than ever with the current election cycle, and it also gives congressional appropriators and other committees confidence that someone appointed by the President of the United States is interested in looking at how our tax dollars are spent. Now, let's face it, no matter how good our CIGAR reports, or a GAO report, or a congressional committee report, or a report or study done right here in Syracuse University can be, if it falls into the background noise of Washington politics or Northern New York politics in Northern New York and goes unnoticed, does it really help anyone? I hope CIGAR's legacy will be judged on what improvements we've made as a result of our work. We cannot simply play the game the agencies would prefer we play in Washington and slip our reports under the door and in the middle of the night with the hope that the taxpayer is none the wiser. So after 15 years and nearly $115 billion of reconstruction, we have to learn the lessons we can from Afghanistan. Unchecked corruption in Afghanistan continues to threaten the reconstruction effort. Time is running out. Surveys indicate that Afghan optimism is at its lowest level in decades, as is confidence in the government. If we are going to work with the Afghans to address this problem, we must identify what we've done wrong in the past, how we can improve it in the future, and make sure those lessons cut through the Beltway noise. And if we do so, one day, you all may find yourself working on a reconstruction effort in Syria, Yemen, or you name it, And I hope you'll try and keep some of these things that will be printed in these reports as they come over the next year or so in mind. And that's why I'm happy to speak to you today, and even happier to answer any questions you have. Thank you. I think I ran a little bit over. We got about 15 minutes, but I can stay a lot longer if anybody wants to stay. But should open the floor. Any questions? Silence falls on. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the number of 115 billion, and you said you recovered 2 billion. So just doing the math, that's 98.4% that you didn't see anything wrong with. So by that metric, we're doing pretty good. What's the best metric to measure corruption? Can you pick out a number? I know there's Transparency International. They have their version of how to do it. But if I'm going to look at any one number, what one would you tell us to look at?
That's not a good metric, how much we've recovered and compared to the total amount spent. Because we're like, and apropos of Syracuse University, we're like investigator Colombo, Peter Falk, who graduated same place, Maxwell School, I think. By the time we show up, not only is the body gone, even the chalk outline is gone. I mean, most of the money spent in Afghanistan was spent before I showed up, 4.5 years ago. So it's very difficult for us to find out how bad things are. The record keeping is horrendous. And now the security situation is even worse, that nobody can get out there and see the horror stories. So how much money's been wasted? I get asked that question all the time by Congress and reporters and whatever, and I can't really tell you. I can tell you it's in the billions, and I can also tell you it's too much. We've wasted too much. How much has been stolen? I can't. I just don't have the time to track that down. It's almost impossible. I know the Wartime Contracting Commission, which was set up by Congress and looked at Iraq and Afghanistan, I think I'm trying to think, it was a 60, 70 billion they came up, but I don't know where they came up with that number. I can just tell you, almost every program we look at, I'm not saying it's stolen, the money's stolen, but it's just waste. I mean, and it's unfortunate. There are successes. I don't want you to go away and say all of that money and the 2,400 GIs who died was a waste. It wasn't. Things are better in Afghanistan. But ultimately, I mean, it has to be better. You pour that much money in such a small country, something's going to stick. Something's going to work. The real question is, could we have done it better? And the other question is, did by us pouring so much money so fast in such a small country with so little oversight almost guarantee disaster and almost guarantee waste? And what our report is saying is it did. So that is the lessons learned, and we can do a lot better, I think, on this in the future, because we are going to do this again. You know that. And I know that from the information I'm getting, that we're planning. There are little planning cells. There's contracts out there. Actually, there's money to be made by all of you. There's contracts out there. Government agencies are always planning ahead. They're planning how to spend your taxpayer dollars, and which is good. That's one thing we say you should plan. But take into consideration the amount of money. And actually, if you go to page 51, I'm so proud of my team. I didn't do this because I can't even read. But fascinating. It's the first time we actually graphically took an analysis that was done by a number of professors on absorptive capacity and overlaid reconstruction money. And this is where it shows where, you can't see from here, but over the chart, how we're so much higher than the absorptive capacity. But this is something that professors have said, who have looked at reconstruction around the world, said, you got to take it into consideration. And what we tried to do is graphically show how what that actually means. Anyway, I hope that answers questions. All right, you left. So anyway, another satisfied customer. So. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry.
So you kind of drew a pretty clear link between government's hesitancy to have stuff in the public eye and their hesitancy to address corruption in other countries. So given that, What do you think is just driving that fear for government to own up and say, you know, if we do this, it's probably going to lead to corruption?
Well, it goes beyond corruption. Look, we have incentivized, we have disincentivized, let's say, being honest to the American taxpayer and to Congress. We have a 2-year or 1 year, sometimes there's some multi-year money, appropriation cycle, okay? So you get the money, and immediately Congress and everybody wants to have you solve the problem. So the poor agency, to get the next appropriations, has to come in usually with bogus data. You know, oh, kites and balloons, everything's working. So they get the next year's funding. Reconstruction doesn't work that way. I mean, if you talk to real people who know development, it's 20 to 30 years to get things done. But I think we're forcing people to come in with unrealistic timelines. So that's one of the reasons why people don't want to talk. People get embarrassed. Nobody likes to be pilloried. You know, you're not going to get your next job if it turns out that your program was a total failure. Now, if you come in honestly with honest appraisal of the problems you're facing and how difficult it's going to be, I mean, look, maybe I'm old school. I'm just a simple country lawyer from Ohio. I always thought honesty is the best policy. Even the politicians. Tell the truth. Tell the American taxpayer that, look, Afghanistan's a really difficult place. We don't know if it's going to work, but let's try this. Now, I don't know. I always kind of believe that, you know, that kind of honesty, because when I was on the Hill, I respected that. I know Sam Nunn respected that. I know John Dingell respected that. So be honest. Be honest to the American taxpayer. You know, not everything is going to work, but we're going to try. But if it's really stupid, we're not going to try it. And I don't think enough people really risk being honest to the taxpayer. I mean, you know, maybe I'm old school. We'll see what happens in this election cycle. Maybe I'm really off the base. But I just think honesty is the best policy. Let's just tell it what it's like. Wouldn't that be a real refreshing breath of fresh air to find people honestly come in and say, we don't know if it's going to work, but we think we should. But reason we're doing it is for the following reasons. And I'll tell you, this is the problem we find time and time again. And I talked to a class today about it. Inputs, outputs, outcomes. You know what those are? Inputs, outputs, outcomes. If you guys walk away today understanding those three principles, you could go down in history as a tremendously important bureaucrat in Washington. Because I find people, ambassadors, generals, and whatever, who don't know the difference. I find people on the Hill who don't know it. Input is the amount of money going in, right? Now, usually when we come to a government agency, see, we don't make these things up. We go to the agency and say, okay, AID, here's your program, $125 million. That's your input. Well, we didn't really spend 125, we only spent 10. Oh, okay, what happened to the rest of the money? Sometimes they can explain it, sometimes they can't. When you look at the SERP program, they don't even know how much money they got. And they don't even know what they spent. But let's assume it's a normal program. SERP is the Commander's Emergency. Record keeping was horrible. So, input, how much money was spent? How much money went into the program? What was the output? What did you tell Congress and what did you tell OMB before you got the money? We were going to buy boots. We were going to train soldiers. How many soldiers? What were you going to train them on? Okay, that's an output. But here's the big question. Outcome. You did tell Congress and OMB why you were doing this. That's the outcome. We were doing this to make certain the Afghan military could defend the citizens. We did this so this airplane could fly. That's a beautiful one. Look at the G222. That's 400 million, G222. G222, $400 million, taxpayer dollars. We bought an airplane out of the Italian Air Force boneyard, rebuilt it to give to the Afghans so they had lift capability, short runway lift capability. Turned out it was the wrong airplane for the altitude. Second thing is, the planes were all crap, and they weren't rebuilt properly. We actually talked to a couple pilots who referred to them as death planes. And one of them who flew into Kabul airport when he flew it in, and parts fell off. Now, I don't want to go too further than this because some kumbads of mine, who's Italian here, You know, it was rebuilt in Sicily, in Naples, Naples and Sicily, I don't know, maybe some of my relatives were involved. But anyway, the question is, why did we do it? Because the plane couldn't fly. And later, all 20 of them got scrapped and turned into little pieces of metal for 6 cents on the dollar. Inputs, outputs, outcome. There was no outcome there. People don't understand it. We don't make these up. Let me just tell you. We ask the agencies, what was the input, what was the output, what was the outcome? Be honest with us. And most agencies don't. Now, part of the problem is rotation. You're only there for 6 months, 9 months, a year. When the shit hits the fan, excuse my French, I'm gone. Somebody else is going to deal with it, okay? Or the contracting officer gets rewarded for putting money on contract. I've had many contracting officers come up to me and say, look, John, I agree with you, but I get my performance review on how many millions of dollars I put on contract. I'm not rewarded on whether the contract, they don't even care if it works or not. But I get my reward and then I'm gone. That's what we face. And I don't want to, I'm not filibustering, but while we're on this subject, just keep this in mind. What we are seeing in Afghanistan is what's wrong with the way the U.S. government works. Our HR system is broke. And if you don't believe me, then why did a Chinese or somebody have every known personnel record of every government employee? And they didn't even know they were being stolen. Why is it that you can't hire the right person and you can't fire the wrong person? Why is it that since World War II, we haven't been able to rotate troops properly? We haven't figured that out. Procurement. General Accounting Office, or General Accountability Office, it was changed, and I use the old name because I grew up with them. GAO has had a high-risk list. A list since 1991 of every major program in the United States government that's going to fail or is at risk to fail. DOD procurement has been the first one on that list and been on that list and has never come on that list since 1991. And I throw this out. When's the last time you heard the DOD IG say that? We don't want to make waves. Okay. But it's on the list. So you give a broken HR system to our poor guys over in Afghanistan. You give them a procurement system to our poor guys in Afghanistan. You give all of these broken tools to our ambassadors, to our aid officials, to our DOD officials, and then you wonder why we can produce a report like this? It's easy. It's broke. Now, this is not partisan. This is the way the government works, and we as taxpayers and we as IGs have to expose it. My job is not to, I don't do policy. I just do process. I give you the facts. You, the taxpayer's representative, Congress, and the administration deals with it. We just report the facts. And here's one thing I will tell you. No one has been able to show any facts we have produced in any of our reports. And we produce now 30-some reports a quarter. When I came, there was only 3 a quarter. No one has ever shown any of the facts being wrong. I take it back. Once there was. We used the NAID number and it was wrong. And we corrected it. We got the number from USAID. So keep that in mind. As Harry Truman said, I didn't give them hell. I just reported the facts, and they thought they were in hell. And that's what we do for a living. Yes, ma'am.
How do you or other government agencies determine or measure the absorbability of a nation or a government in terms of the amount of developmental programs that they can and are willing to absorb, and also the threshold of what is too much?
You're beyond my pay grade. I didn't come up with the analysis. A number of professors around the world had sort of accepted this 15 to 45%, and the worse the country is, or less developed, the lower it should be if it overwhelms them. I don't know how they came up with that, to be honest with you. It's described in the report. How much money will they take? You give them the money, the country will take it. You know, they're not going to say, oh, no, we can't take that money. In Afghanistan, they took every penny we could give them. So I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know how it was figured out, but it's explained in the report. What we just did is we took U.S. appropriated funds. Now, we didn't distinguish between spent and appropriated, nor did we include, because we couldn't get the information, how much our allies. So we're not even including the allies' funds. So it could be even worse.
So this discussion could go on a long time, and Mr. Sopko has agreed to stay for a while if there are other questions, but I also want to make sure that he gets some lunch since we're exploiting him today. Thank you very much for an incredibly rich and slightly...
Thank you.